Hi there, and welcome to the Excelling with Pivot Tables workshop, brought to you by the Graduate Statistics Studio here at Fresno State. Here we have a data set that's on the website, available whenever you want. Today we're going to be talking about pivot tables, and I'll be using this data set. Let's go ahead and talk about the data set. There's a data dictionary tab here, which is very useful. I've mentioned it in the last workshop. It's a great way to describe what your variables do. So here we see the variable name for each of our variables, what the values for those are, the description for them, and if there's any coding involved. Before we begin talking about pivot tables, I would first like to show you a couple of useful functions. If we head back over to the raw data section, we want to count some of these variables. So we'll be using a function called count. Now there are multiple ways that we can do this. If we wanted to know how many residents there were, we could highlight this section, scroll all the way to the bottom. Now it's going to take a while because there should be 1,000 cases here. Once we reach the bottom, we see it ends on row 1001, but we also see that the count is 1,000. And the sum is 1,997, although the sum isn't actually necessary because if we refer back to the data dictionary, we see that resident is just determining if the student was a resident in the state. We have 1 yes, 2 out of state, and 3 international. If we head back over to the raw data, we head back to the top. There is another way we can do this. If we end up adding more data to this later, we could create a function or just use a built-in function called equals count. What it does is it counts the number of cells in a specific range. So if we open this up and we just select L, close it up, and when we press enter, it tells us there are 1,000. So it counted up the number of cells with values in it, and it determined that there was 1,000. If we go to the bottom and say we created another student in here, once we head back up to the top, we see now that it counts 1,001. So this will automatically update as we move throughout. Another way to do this would be to use count if. What count if does is that it counts specific values in a range. If we wanted to know how many uh, state residents there were, so 1 is yes, we go back over here, we want to select L, and we want to know how many state residents there were. So we need to type in 1. There are 321 students who were state residents. Another way that we could identify all of the state residents would be by using filters. Under the Home ribbon, all the way under the section Editing, if we click on Sort and Filter, the filter option is right here. When we click on it, these little down arrow boxes show up under each column. Keep in mind that Excel recognizes the first row as your variable names. So if we click on Resident, it shows us every option available under Resident. We have 1, 2, and 3. We have yes, they were a state resident, no, they were out of state, and 3, they were international. If we click on Select All, it unchecks everything. But we only want to look at state residents. If we check 1, what should happen is that it'll filter out everything except for 1. When we press OK, we'll see now only 1s are showing up. It goes all the way to the bottom. You may be wondering why our original count disappeared over here. And the reason for that is probably because we didn't have it on a row with 1s. So what ends up happening when you filter is that it hides all the rows that aren't 1. If we look over here at row numbers, we see row 1 is still here, but the next row after that is 6. We see this small space in between, and that's because Excel is hiding all of the rows that aren't that don't contain resident 1. If we go back in, we select all again. Now we get it back. We'll see that our original count was on a resident 2, and our state resident was on a row with 2 as well. That is why they were filtered out. If we filter out 1 and 3, so that 2 remains, this should remain as well. When we press OK, notice how they still stick around. Filters can be more complicated than what we've done so far. So far, what we've done is filtered resident so that only the 2's show up. But let's also filter out students who were not first generation students. So if we go over to FG, our variable that indicates first generation, we can look it up in the data dictionary if need be. And we want to select those students who are first generation only. So if we uncheck 0, which indicates that they're not first generation students, what will end up happening are students who are state residents, or excuse me, out of state residents, and who were also first generation students. If we go down here, we'll see 177 of the 1,000 records were found, which is letting us know that 177 students were first generation students. And of those 177 first generation students, they were all out of state residents. And let's filter it even further than that. Let's only include those first generation students who were math majors. If we uncheck English and science, now it's only including math majors who were first generation, who were out of state residents. And let's include one more, who received financial aid. And let's go crazy and say who lived on campus. So we only have 8 students who fulfill that requirement. So that is 8 students who were first generation students, had a math major, lived on campus, received financial aid, and came from out of state. So you can see that filters can get complicated very quickly. Instead of filtering so much, what we could use instead is a pivot table. Let's go ahead and unfilter everything in here. Okay, so now that everything is unfiltered, if we click anywhere in here, well, let's first remove this actually. We don't want this here. If we click anywhere in here, we go over to the Insert ribbon, and we have an option called Pivot Table. If we click on Pivot Table, this dialog box will show up. It says Create Pivot Table. It wants us to select the range that we want to use. The highlighted section is what it suggests we should use. If we see what it suggested, it says raw data, so it's in the raw data tab, A1, so this is A1, 2, that's what the colon stands for, L 1001. L is over here, 1001 is our last row. So we want to use that one. We want it to be placed in a new worksheet. We could use an existing worksheet, but it's much easier to just use a new worksheet. If we press OK, we are immediately moved to a new sheet with a blank pivot table. Pivot tables are an amazing feature in Excel. What pivot tables can do is that they can easily make counts of data, averages of data. There are filters of filters of filters. You can quickly make all possible filters with pivot tables. So let me show you some of these. If we wanted to identify how many sexes we had F and M, and we wanted to know how many there were of that specific value. So we bring over sex into row, bring over sex into values, and see it says count of sex. So it's counting the number in each one. So we had 464 females, 536 males, for a grand total count of 1,000 participants. If we wanted to make this table a little more specific, we could go into the raw data and change F to female and M to male. So let's go ahead and do that. I've already selected column B. If we click on replace, want M for male, place all, 536 replacements were made. And if we select F for female, 464 replacements were made. Go ahead and close that. When we go back over to sheet 1, it still says F and M. However, we can update it. We go over to the ribbon Analyze under this new section called Pivot Table Tools. If we click Analyze, there's an option here called Refresh. When you press Refresh, it updates it automatically. So now we see male and female. The fun doesn't stop there, because now that we have male and female, we could include many other variables in our pivot table. If we drag age over to values, it gives us the sum of the age for each of our groups, male and female. However, we can change that. If we click on sum of age, value field settings, we see we have a multitude of options. Let's do the average age. So now we see that the average age for males was 44.81 and the average age for females was 44.58. We could include the major that each student had. If we bring major over to rows, it now splits them up between male and female and what their major was. So we see the average age was pretty much the same for each category. We see there were 536 males total, and they were split somewhat evenly between each of the categories. We see science had the most, though. Under female, we have English, math, and science, just like we do with male, and we see that they're relatively evenly distributed, just like before. We could bring over units as another value. We have the sum of all units. We could change that. Value field settings. Let's include the average number of units. So the average number of units was the same for each of the participants. Now, the reason we keep seeing everything be the same is because this data set is a completely fictional random data set. The values that we see in here aren't actually real people. It was all created randomly. So that is why we'd see everything be the same. However, in real life, what you'll often see are these numbers will probably be a lot different from each other. And if we want to include one more variable, we'll include minor. We can put minor under columns, and it spreads it out across. Now this table looks relatively difficult to understand. So if we move minor over to rows, it might make it a little easier to identify. So we have count of sex, we have average age, average units, and we have it broken down from male to female, English, and what their minor was, math, what their minor was, science, what their minor was. And the same breakdown occurs over here. So sometimes it takes some playing around with to identify what table works best for you. It's generally not that useful, in my opinion, to use columns. I find it much easier to use rows. It just seems easier to read. But it is up to personal preference, so you may have something that you like better. The last thing that we'll talk about are pivot charts. We can take a pivot table and create a pivot chart that updates automatically with our pivot table. So if we click on the Pivot Table Tools ribbon under Analyze, we have an option here called Pivot Chart. If we select it, we'll just do a column chart, but you can do anything you want in here. All of these are available to you. We'll click Column, and it creates a chart based on all of the information in here. Now this chart is very noisy. So let's first edit it a little so that we can change it. If we right click on average, any of these buttons here, I want to hide all field buttons on chart. That makes it a little neater. If we move this over, we can change the color, the style, we can change chart elements. This acts just like a regular chart, just it updates automatically based on the pivot table. We want access titles. We don't want grid lines. Legend is useful, so we'll keep that for now. So if we want to change our pivot table so that this isn't so noisy, we can move things out or in. Say we don't really care about sex anymore. We just drag it out and move it over here, and notice there's a little X on the bottom right of my mouse cursor. Once we let go of it, it removes it. The pivot table changed automatically as well as the pivot chart. So now what we're looking at is the count of sex, the average age, and the average of units. But we don't really care about sex, so let's move that out of values. So now it changed it again automatically. So now we're looking at the average age and average number of units for each of these. We can give the axis title something more specific or not. Maybe we don't really want minor involved anymore. So we move out minor, and now we're looking at something a lot simpler. If we wanted to paste this in a Word document, that is completely doable. However, I do advise paying attention to how you're pasting it. So I'll go ahead and show how to do that. If we copy it and we open up a Word document, now that we've opened up a Word document, we want to paste it, but we want to paste it a specific way. You'll notice there are two chain link options right here. They have this little chain looking icon. The first one says use destination theme and link data. The second one says keep source formatting and link data. When you link the data, that means if you change anything in the original pivot table, it'll change the pivot chart in Excel, and it will also change the pivot chart in the Word document. So let me show you how that works. If we use destination theme and link data, if we move back over to the Excel document, we want to remove something or maybe add something, but we'll remove. We don't really want average age. So we take it out. Now we see the average number of units is slightly different for each major. If we go back over to our Word document, we'll see that the pivot chart should have updated automatically as well. And see, it has. We're looking at English, math, science. It changed, just like we wanted it to. You can use this to your advantage, but if you don't want that, if you just want to create tables and figures and paste them and be done with them forever, you can do that as well. If you copy it and you move back over to that Word document, when you paste it, what you need to make sure is that you aren't linking the data. So you want and embed workbook. So this one says keep source formatting and embed workbook. This one says use destination theme and embed workbook. So we'll use the destination theme and embed the workbook. So that way, this will never change no matter what happens to our original data. We see this one will change, this one will not. So let's demonstrate that. We bring over minor under axis categories. See the pivot table changed and the pivot chart also changed. When we go back over to that Word document, what we should see is that the first chart would have changed to this, but the second one will not have changed. So let's take a look. We see the one that was linked to the data changed, but the one that was embedded did not change. And that's everything with pivot tables. It's a very useful tool in Excel. I highly suggest playing around with it the next time you need to make any tables or figures. It is very useful. Thank you.